Right. Well, the reason I was going to share screen was actually to go to the our website, where you would see that our next meeting currently is for Saturday, 2 p.m., October 31st. Loris Grava, who did a session for the Washington Map Society on the maps of the Baltic states, has edited and updated his presentation. So he's going to be our next New York Map Society participant and speaker, and I hope you all have a chance to go on to that. It's at John Doctor's site. I found out about Eric Sanderson through our newest board member, Ian Fowler, who's the curator of maps at the New York Public Library. He's also going to be our go-to person on scheduling speakers beginning in 2021. And when I asked him who are the first people that would want to speak for us, he said, you've got to have Eric Sanderson. Some of you may know Eric from his 2009 book, Mannahatta, which imagined New York City in the year that Henry Hudson first sailed up New York Harbor. What he's going to be talking to us today is the expansion of that Welikia Project to the outer boroughs of New York City. Currently, he's the senior conservation ecologist at the Wildlife Conservation Society. There are links at our site for his very extensive biography, but I'd like to say welcome, Eric, and we're all looking forward to your presentation.
Terrific. Thank you, Andrew, and excuse me, and thank you, Steve, so much for inviting me. Can you hear me all right? Is the audio all right?
I'm going to mute the field. And in fact, I'll leave it open unless if someone's got a lawnmower in the background, I may mute you all. But right now, I think it's pretty good. So
yeah. So like Andrew said, I've been working for a long time on the historical ecology of the New York City region, and I spent 10 years working on what became the Mannahatta Project. In my book about Mannahatta, which is the old Lenape name, the Indian name for Manhattan. And we've been expanding ever since then to do the geography of the other 4 boroughs and to bring it together. And just last year, I was a fellow at the New York Public Library. I was in the Coleman Center, which is a really wonderful experience where essentially you get the run of the library resources. I spent a lot of time in the map room and with Ian. And you get 9 months away from your regular responsibilities. My normal job is with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I'm an ecologist, an ecosystem and landscape ecologist, and most of the time I'm spending my time thinking about tigers and jaguars and lions and bears, wildlife conservation issues all around the world. And so this New York City work, though, is a sort of passion of my heart, and I feel like I'm trying to give a long-term contribution to New York City. So anyway, while I was at the Coleman Center, I developed the concept for a new atlas that'll be coming out over the next few years called the Welikia Atlas, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right. I'll try anyway. Okay. All right, can everybody see that all right? Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Good.
All right. Right. So, and like Steve and Andrew said, I'll talk for maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat window and I'd be happy to try and address those, or comments or suggestions. You know, even though I've been working on this for almost 22 years, I still continue to discover new things. So I'm very happy to hear about what you have to say. So I don't know if you know what we're looking at here, but this is a rendering of we're looking right where the Brooklyn Bridge comes across today. And you can see over there on the left, you can see a little bit of Wallabout Bay, and in the distance, you can see a little bit of Gowanus out here. And then you can, of course, see the terminal moraine, which is Prospect Park and Prospect Heights and Bay Ridge and so forth here in the back. And I know about this because we've been studying this landscape for a long time. And the reason we do this, in some sense, is to restart the history of New York City. In the standard telling of New York, it's, there was this place, there were some Indians, and then the Europeans came by. And if you think about it, it was the Dutch here first, but then in 1664, the Duke of York sent his henchmen over with a piece of paper from his brother, the King Charles II of England. And King Charles basically he wrote a letter patent, and he gave to his brother, James, all the land between the Delaware River and the Connecticut River, and New England and Maine. Even though James or Charles, none of them had ever been here before. But on the basis of that, James here fitted out a ship and sailed across the ocean. And then the Dutch were unprepared and weren't able to do anything. And so after some kind of tense negotiations, the Dutch capitulated. And ever since then, we've called our place New York. And in fact, it's in your name, the New York Map Society. It's the New York Public Library. The name of my institution before we changed it 20 years ago was the New York Zoological Society. And the thing is, every time we say New York, we're in some sense, thinking about this guy. We're recognizing his history and his way of seeing the city. Although there's many things to be said about that legacy, both pro and con, I'm really interested in what came right before that. What was here before the Europeans were here? What is sort of the indigenous state of the landscape? And in some sense, it's like this curtain in the background. Like if you could pull that curtain back away, what would you see if you could see the landscape of the past? So that's really what I'm going to talk about today, is sort of lifting the curtain. And I want to share with you some of my methods and how I use historical maps, and then talk to you a little bit about the atlas, and then talk to you in the end about this related tool, this platform for everybody to make maps going forward of what they would like New York City to be. And I'll say that, I'm not I've I have a lot of experience looking at old maps, but I'm not a historical cartographer or historian of cartography, anything like that. I'm really much more someone who uses maps. And so when I look at these old maps, I'm always thinking, why were they made? When were they made? What kind of technology did they have? And that in itself is completely fascinating. But what I'm really trying to get to is, what was the landscape like? So for example, if you look at this detail from Hassler's chart of New York Harbor from 1844, part of the US Coastal Survey, we take maps like this, which is really, a very extraordinary map, very beautiful. And then the first thing we do is we georeference it in the computer. So we take maps, and, in the 19th century, people were already drawing maps, and even in some of the late 18th century, drawing maps that had enough geographic precision that you could actually overlay them in a geographic information system, in a GIS, so that you can actually see where the buildings, in this case, those are the red areas, and the streets, which are black in this image, how the modern city overlies this landscape. And so, I don't know if you notice, like, this is the Rockaway Peninsula in Queens. And what this is suggesting is that there are buildings. This is Breezy Point out here. And it's actually 2 miles from the end of the land in 1844. It's the Rockaway Peninsula is a barrier island, or a beach, and that's been growing to the west and west so far that 150 years later, people are building their houses here. And of course, these houses, many of them were destroyed during Hurricane Sandy. This kind of work is sort of this looking through the past to learn lessons about our modern state and what the future would be. That's sort of the way I sort of see these things. So they're interesting for themselves, but they're also interesting for what they tell us about how the landscape is changing. So we georeference these maps, and then we digitize features off of them, like the tidal wetlands, which is the light green here, or the forest blocks, which is the dark green. We digitize the bathymetry and the depths under the water, or topographic information. We digitize the shoreline, and there's many different shorelines, because of course the shoreline has been changing over time, not just because of tidal variation, but also because of long-term sea level rise. much of which in the modern era is related to climate change, of course. But there's actually been sea level rise before that because of the effect of the glaciers 20,000 years ago and this process of isostatic rebound of the landscape, which is readjusting the height of the land relative to the height of the sea. And so, you know, we take on any map and we look at hundreds of maps and digitize the shorelines from them, and then we relate them to modern reconstructions using other scientific techniques of how sea level is changing, as in this, the figure in the bottom right here. And then that way we can build up the topography of the past. And we do this not just for Hassler's map, but for, you know, Connor's map of 1852 of Queens, of Ratzer's plan of 1767 of Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, the British headquarters map, which is a really fine map, a very detailed document that we used, you know, extensively in my work on Mannahatta. You know, all the coastal surveys, we've georeferenced the entire set for the New York City region, all the 19th century maps, and not just the printed published maps, but also the manuscript maps. Those are available, like this set from Staten Island. I don't know if you know this chart, or Blaskowitz's map from 1776 up in the eastern Bronx, or this one, Taylor and Skinner from 1781 of the Bronx, so forth and so on. They're just, you know, many, many maps. And so then we, and this is why the work takes so long, is you have to find the maps, you need to understand their context, and then you need to georeference them, and then you need to digitize them. And when you digitize them, you get just, you know, thousands of lines and features in the GIS that then need to be synthesized and brought together. Because not every map, of course, shows the landscape in the same form, some of which relates to the topography of those maps, some of which relates to landscape change. And sometimes it just relates to what people thought was of interest, because no map can actually tell you everything you want to know. And then we compile all of those together into these sort of synthetic maps. For example, here's the topography, and not just the topography of any one of those maps, but trying to project back in time to the topography of the New York City landscape in the early 17th century, around the time Henry Hudson arrived. So you can see this line here is the terminal moraine, which marks the end of the last glaciation, the Wisconsin glaciation about 21,000 years ago. You can see Jamaica Bay and the Rockaways. This is Sandy Hook down here. The blue colors here are showing the bathymetry, the depths under the water, because that's also important. Many of these canyons you see in the water in Long Island Sound or through the Narrows relate to these gigantic flood events that happened during the post-glacial times. And of course, this topographic information is really important for the ecology that follows, because it matters if you're being flooded by salt water, and it matters how often you're being flooded by it, and it matters there, you know, whether you're on the north side slope or the south slope, et cetera, et cetera. You know, these sort of fundamental relationships at the base of the geography have such enormous ramifying effect on the ecology that follows. And we've done this for the New York City region, which is why it has this sort of weird shape. So a few years ago, we decided we would expand the view out some to get a more circular form, thinking, of course, of the wonderful tradition of, you know, maps in the round for New York City, you know, like, you know, the maps from 30 miles around the center of New York, like Eddie's maps from the early 19th century, for example. And then within that, we have the hydrology, the streams, in this case, and the tidal channels, the springs, the wetlands, which are these pink. So there's, you know, more extensive salt marshes in the New York City region, as well as freshwater wetlands of various kinds. And then we also pay a lot of attention to the Native Americans and the archaeology and historical sources and all the descriptions we can find about where the Lenape people, that's the people that were here in the early 17th century, where they were, as well as there's a few sites around New York City that are much older. The archaeologists think that human beings have been in this part of the world for about 8,000 years. And the Lenape were here for, you know, maybe a few thousand before Henry Hudson showed up. And of course, this is probably just a sub-fraction of all the places they might have been. Probably, you can see how strongly coastal these sites are. Probably anywhere that was on the coast and there was a freshwater supply nearby was a place where some Lenape people over the long history of time hung out and hunted and fished and did their activities. So just to give you a little bit more insight into what natural process, we have a cataloging system to keep track of all the maps because there's so many, and also the text resources. And then I work with volunteers and I work with students, have for many years. So we also have to have a way to track all the pieces of work. There's getting the original scan of the map, a high resolution scan, there's georeferencing that map, and then there's digitizing the features on that map. And so, we keep track of that, and then, the students, I can put them in. And the reason we do this is so that when the next person comes, I can say, well, just, go look at SGR6 and then please digitize this feature, or grab the streams off of that and see how they integrate with this other source. And then we use Zotero, which is an online bibliographic program to keep track of all the references, and everything's all linked together digitally so that you can pick a map, you can pick a feature on the map, you can see which map it came from, and then you can find the bibliographic details of that map, including things like the which archive it's from and the catalog, the call number, and so forth and so on. So we're trying to be trying to build these data structures that are as transparent as possible all the way through the research. Something else we do is we collect names, both from the maps themselves as well as text documents. So we collect names, and we have a place name database or a toponym database, which allows us to handle synonymies. Many places have many names. Some of them have Lenape names, and then there's Dutch names, and then there's English names, and then American names. So that's all completely fascinating. Just the naming history is so interesting. And then we actually capture direct quotes out of these about the locations or the descriptions or the later developments. If it's a name on a map, we just make a note that this name is on this map and this is about where it is. But then for text sources, we actually get descriptions. And that means actually we can use information that's older than, say, the late 18th century to sort of make sure that our landscape view, our synthesis is actually reflecting all the different pieces of information. So we'll look at a stream, and we'll look at the 3 maps on the stream, and then we'll read the description of the stream from the 4 sources that describe that stream, and then we'll try and make sure that they all work together, and also that the stream goes downhill, right? Water has to flow downhill, and so it also has to match with the alignment of the hills that we're creating. And then we have a process of matching the names to the features, as you can see in this little sketch from the South Bronx, from the Bronx River. And of course, we started this mostly to make sure we grabbed all the ecological detail, but I've kind of become obsessed with all the names of these, features in New York City, many of which are lost, but some are still here in remnant form, or some are actually being restored. So I actually feel like this is a really valuable contribution over the long run. We also use views like this view from Victor Gifford Audubon from 1843. This is John James Audubon's son, and that's his father sitting on the rock watching the men bring in the fish from the Hudson River. And so this is about 125th Street, Manhattanville, on the west side of Manhattan, where the Fairway Market is. And there's a little park there now. And we're looking north, and you're seeing Washington Heights, and that bit of land that's sticking out in the river, that's Jeffrey's Hook, and that's where the George Washington Bridge goes across today to the Palisades in New Jersey. So we use these views also confirm, well, there's a beach, there are some rocks on that beach. This is where there was forest. You can actually get a little sense of the slope. You have to be careful, of course, because just like all the other documents, you have to interpret them in terms of what the artist can do and what they were meaning to show. Turns out this view it's huge. I forget the exact size, but if you see it, it's actually a wall-size painting, and you can actually identify the fish to species because they're so carefully drawn. Really wonderful. We also use some photography, some modern photography where needed. Also historical photography and images. There's a couple here from the New York Public Library, the Rocking Stone up in the Bronx, and Jacksonville Creek in Queens, which is somewhere buried deep underneath LaGuardia Airport now. And then we also keep track of all of the ecological relationships. So after we do all this work, we list all the aspects of the environment, all the plants and animals, and all the abiotic environments that's tied to the maps, and then we connect them together with all those habitat relationships. I can describe this in more detail during the question answer part if you like, but the idea is that we can describe the ecological relationships of all the plants and animals that used to be on Mannahatta and now Welikia. We can visualize those as here, and then probably most importantly is we can then use these networks to make new maps. So we can say, well, you know, if a beaver needs alders and willows and a beaver needs streams and a beaver needs aspens, well, then you take those maps together and you add them up and you get the habitat of the beavers. And it turns out that these webs are like, you know, they're super thick. They're just enormously, well, I think they're really beautiful. But they show the connections, and they show that, you know, everything in nature is connected to everything else, and not directly. You know, things have sort of first order connections and then second order and then third order. And these, you know, each of these little points here is a different plant or animal or a stream type or soil type. And each of those gray lines represents a separate entry in the database describing its habitat connections to something else. And of course, one of these dots over here, I forget which one, is the Lenape people, right? That they also were, you know, both influencing other species, but were connected to those species. And I think, you know, this is sort of one of the larger points, which is that, you know, in our human lives, we're so connected to our social networks and to our societies and our colleagues and our friends and family that sometimes we forget this much, much larger network that also exists that we are embedded in, and that is actually essential to our lives, that we wouldn't be able to live here on Earth if it was not for the evolving patterns of these network connections. So then what all this means is, you know, everything's georeferenced, and we have the mirror web, and we have all these synthesized inputs. So we can take a spot like Newtown Creek here in between Brooklyn and Queens, and we can see what was the bedrock geology of that site, and what was the superficial geology, the geology that the glaciers left. And then we can drive a map of the soil types. So each of these red and green colors represents a different type of soil. We can, you know, map the topography and the bathymetry, as you've seen. And then the hydrology, the surface hydrology, and in some senses also the groundwater hydrology, particularly on Long Island and Queens, the groundwater is very important. And then the wetlands that were associated with those streams and features, low-lying places on the landscape. And then from this map, the ecological communities. And I'm just showing you each individual one, because if I showed you all the colors, it wouldn't make any sense, because it's so many. There's about 200 ecological communities across the city that we're mapping. Low salt marsh and maritime oak forest and coastal oak hickory chestnut forest. This is where you would have found American chestnuts in the past. And then from that, on top of that, the different species. So this is a map of the clustered flower bluet, which is this, you know, little tiny plant that grows on the edges of marshes. Really, a really beautiful, beautiful plant found in the past. And here's an example where we actually have a source. This is from John Torrey's first book. John Torrey was an important American botanist in the 19th century, grew up on Manhattan, and he wrote a book about the plants within 30 miles of New York City. And he noticed that there were cluster flower bluets growing in a swamp about a mile from Brooklyn on Long Island. And that's what our distribution maps show. Or, you know, cordgrass, smooth cordgrass. It's a description from 1915 of the Bushwick Inlet. Or the Eskimo curlew, you know, which is a bird that's now extinct. It's a shore bird, but used to come by in these huge flocks during the migration times. These mermations, as they were called. And so, you know, the whole point of this work is to try and bring all these different kinds of information together: the historical geography, the historical cartography, the historical biological accounts, and to synthesize them together into this sort of unified view of what the landscape was like in the past, and then to tell stories on top of that. Stories of coastal oak hickory forest, or salt marshes, or maritime oak forest. Like I said, it's all georeferenced. So this, I don't know if you recognize this image I ran in the New York Times in August, in a story that I did a virtual walk with Michael Kimmelman, the Times architecture critic, and we started at Yankee Stadium, And so if you could imagine standing in center field of Yankee Stadium, or the place that would be Yankee Stadium 400 years ago, this is what you might have seen looking toward home plate. So just to give you some ideas of the numbers, just to wrap up this sort of methodological section. So these are actually from last March, so the numbers are a little bit bigger now, but 500 maps consulted, about half of those we've georeferenced. I don't even know how many features we've digitized, tens of thousands. Our database has 2,800 places with names, features with names. There's many more features I still don't know their names, you know, hills and streams and so forth. 5,700 different names. Of course, many places have multiple names. Over 7,700 descriptions, 590 references. I'm sure this is much higher. This number is much higher since March. And some summaries of the geography that New York City had, you know, almost 500 miles of streams, 470 miles of shoreline, at least 1,200 ponds, at least 500 springs, thousands of acres of freshwater wetland and tidal wetland, many, many Lenape sites, and many, many miles of trails. And the Muir Web has almost 2,500 elements, almost 10,000 relationships. And that one of the, I think, fascinating things about this is, as an ecological matter, you have to input about 120 maps, and then the computer then derives from them another 2,200 maps, if you can imagine. I mean, and this is just a measure of what modern mapping is. This is what it means to work in cartography today. And like I said, when I gave this talk in March, it was 21 years and counting, 90 research assistants, dozens of people, and really hundreds of people that I've talked to about this over the years. Oftentimes after I give a talk, people come up to me and say, hey, do you know about this? Or can you tell me anything about that? And I often learn little bits of information. It just seems like the history of New York City's geography is just infinitely deep. I mean, I mean, I've been working on it for so long, and yet every time I go to write up something, I learn something new, which I find both wonderful and very frustrating. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Atlas and what I'm planning. I think it'll probably still be a couple more years before the Atlas is out, but I just love to get your feedback about this. You know, one of the things I have to do with the Atlas is think how it relates to Mannahatta. Mannahatta, you know, was a great success. It was a bestseller, much to my surprise, actually. And people love it, and people continue to buy it. It's sold over 50,000 copies. The hardback copy like this, you can't get them anymore. They're only on the rare book market now. And there was a New York Times article in May, and the book sold out on Amazon, and people were selling, you know, kind of mint copies of the hard copy for over $1,000. That just blew me away. So, but you know, Mannahatta was sort of this story of Eric comes to New York and, you know, kind of winds up looking at some old maps and finds a way to reconstruct what the landscape was like in the past. And I don't think I can tell that same story in the same way again, because it's 20 years on. So you know, one of the challenges when I started my year at the Coleman Center was to think how to frame this a little bit differently, in a way that gives a lot of respect, not just to Manhattan, but to all the amazing, wonderful places across the city. I mean, you know, because the Dutch set up a camp at the tip of Manhattan, you know, Manhattan is grown to be the center of the city. But if you'd ask a Lenape person, they wouldn't have said, you know, the tip of Manhattan was the most important place. You know, they would have said, well, Spuyten Duyvil is pretty cool at the northern end of the island, or Pelham Bay Park, you know, was a really wonderful place, or the southern part of Staten Island, that was a fantastic place to live. So they would have, you know, interpreted the same geography in a really different way. And I want to tell that story that's true to the many, many, many wonderful places across the city. So yeah, so and then another thing is that, you know, Mannahatta was an illustrated book, and I worked with my friend and colleague, Mark Lee Boyer, on the images for that book. And they're so beautiful that sometimes people don't read the words, which kind of hurts my feelings a little bit, because I really think I worked really hard on the words. I can't tell you how many times people tell me, you know, I've had your book for many years and I've loved it. And then one day I started reading, and it was so interesting, Eric. And, I mean, that's wonderful, but that's not exactly what an author wants to hear. An author wants to hear, like, I bought your book and I read it cover to cover and I thought it was so extraordinary and the pictures were nice too. So, I'm still working on how to make the words as lively as the pictures while still realizing that the pictures are so very important. And then, the thing, and this might be relevant to you all, which is, we had to sacrifice something in Mannahatta, and the thing we sacrificed was the size of the maps, which were these kind of very spare and kind of hard to see the details. Maps are just too damn small, and so we want in the new atlas to actually show the maps at a scale that's large enough that we can actually see. Something else that's been interesting is that because of our sort of digital workflow, we can build these really cool websites that allow you to zoom in to any block in Manhattan, and eventually we'll work this out for the whole city and see the list of all the plants and animals, actually get a taste of the model results, but in a kind of attractive and easily consumable kind of way. What's the list of all the mammals that used to live in the block where I live, or the birds, or the reptiles, or the fish, or the plants, or how far was it to the closest Lenape site, or what was the soil type? So, trying to give some insight into the deep ecology of specific blocks in New York City where specific people live. But this just opens the question of, well, how does a book relate to a website? Because there's some things you can do really well with a website, like this kind of localization to a specific place. But it's hard to, like the plant list for this block between 61st and 62nd Street, might be 400 plants long. And if you were to detail those in a book, that might be very, very boring. So that's something else I've been thinking about. And so, our idea is, to create an atlas and a gazetteer, I should say. That's the current plan. So, and the atlas would have a series of plates, 30 some odd, depending a little bit on the size of the eventual book, the book trim. This is imagining 11 by 14 inch plates at 1 to 24,000 scale. So we can pick one of those or a couple of these. I'll show you some examples. And our idea is to sort of use the USGS quadrangle format, kind of like you would use for a hiking map or a demographic map, but actually do it for the 1609 landscape. So as a way of actually showing what the New York City landscape looked like 400 years ago. And I think I have an example here where you can zoom in a little bit to Lower Manhattan. And you can see we're privileging and making bigger the Lenape names where we know those, like Merrick here for Brooklyn, or Mannahatta for Manhattan. But where we don't know the Lenape names, we're putting in the English names or the Dutch names. You can see we're sort of adopting the same style. So the green colors on this map are reflective of where the forest cover was. And the light colors are reflecting of where you would have more open systems. And we have a salt marsh symbol and a freshwater marsh symbol. We're putting in the topographic contours so you can see those, as well as doing some hill shading so that you get a little sense of the relief as well. And the idea is, that this would then be gridded up in these boxes here so that then you could, read a name on one of these maps. You could read, Governor's Island or Prince's Reef, and then go look it up in the gazetteer. And the gazetteer would have these entries that would, have some sort of standard format. We're still, working out exactly what this is, but the name, its location, its UTM coordinates, which plate it's on, and then sort of a short, pithy statement about what it is and what happened to it. So, Oakland Lake is actually a really beautiful lake in Queens and Bayside, Queens. A spring-fed forest pond ensconced in a ravine in southeastern Queens, now protected in Alley Pond Park. And then there would be a description that would describe, what it is and where it is, that would connect it to other nearby features. And you can see they're, in this example, they're italicized, so that these would all be entries you could go look up in other parts of the gazetteer. And there would be, for these sort of long format ones, the idea is to write something about what it was like 400 years ago and how it came to be that way, and then another paragraph that would describe its subsequent history. That Oakland Lake was Douglas Pond, it was a mill pond, it was part of the Flushing water system for a while. They were actually taking the water out. There's also, there was this rumor running around in the 50s and 60s that it was it was 600 feet deep, and that there was a big underwater river that was flowing out into Little Neck Bay. And so these people in 1969 actually went diving into Oakland Lake, and they discovered it was 20 feet deep. Just crazy. And then, of course, and then it connects with the conservation history, because Oakland Lake was suffering a lot, during the construction of Queensborough College and the suburban development of this part of the city. And there was a corresponding movement to save Oakland Lake and nearby Alley Creek, which is why we have Alley Creek Park, so forth and so on. And then, just thinking about future historians, so they don't have to go back and read all these texts, then the idea is we would list all the relevant texts, or as many of those texts that I know. There might be other things, of course, with the reference and the page number, and then also which maps show this feature. And to do this for the current plan is about 2,500 features for New York City. And then, to accompany them with renderings or maps or historical photography or images. Some of them would be, of course, much shorter, like this description of Turtle Pond. And still, keeping track of the descriptions and where we get the information. And, in some cases, we can use modern imagery, like that's Oakland Lake. It's really, really beautiful place. Or this little detail of Connor's map here, showing Oakland Lake. Okay, so, and there are just so many names, and the names are just so wonderful. This is just a sample of them, and some we might remember today, like I don't know, like Mount Prospect or Woodland Lawn Brook or Gibbons Creek. Those things still exist, but other ones don't exist at all. And some, are names that were used 200 years ago, and then people have just not used them in any sense. And so it's also a wonderful way to sort of see back into the history of the city and the geography of the city. And then, of course, we're always keeping in mind this idea that, that there were these features and that they were connected to the ecology, and that, of course, that ecology has changed subsequently. This is a really important idea for me, which is all this work and all these investigations into the past are really about helping us think about the future. Because of course, when a lot of people, they think of New York City and they might think of, I don't know, some neighborhood like, I don't know, Gowanus as an industrial neighborhood, or Manhattan as a financial neighborhood. But, that is really to privilege a very, very narrow piece of its history. For most of New York City, its history is as a forest or a wetland. Like the forests of Lower Manhattan were there for at least 12,000 years before Henry Hudson showed up. And that they were used by people for thousands and thousands of years before Europeans showed up. And moreover, that, long before even the glaciers, there were other things happening in this landscape. There were, dinosaurs, it was flooded, there was, mountain ranges. If you get into the deep geological history, it takes you back millions and millions of years and tells just enormously fascinating stories, which somehow just are not part of our normal conception of the city. And because of that, when we deal with kind of geological level events like a changing climate, we have a really hard time adjusting. And so I think that's why this work, is really important for helping us sort of picture what it means to actually be a human being, and be a human being in the early 21st century, living in New York City, loving New York City, but wanting New York City to evolve into a form that can be as sustainable and productive as the forests that came before. To really think about cities as habitat for people, where, habitat for any species means that it's a place that, you can get your food and you can get the water, fresh water you need, and that you can find shelter in whatever terms that means for you, that you can, raise your kids and you can find a mate and you can, have a loving relationships. These overlapping things, this is the underlying idea under Muirwebs, is that every species needs food, needs water, needs shelter, needs to find what it needs for reproduction. And human beings need, I think, arguably one other thing, which is a sense of meaning. Maps are a wonderful way to see meaning, both in their own terms through history, but also in the kind of maps that we're drawing for the future. What kind of meanings are we trying to convey, and how do we find, happiness and joy and satisfaction and hope in the maps that we draw of the future? And, you know, I think one of the things that's so extraordinary in New York is over the last 20 or 30 years, you know, people have been coming from New York for a long time to get a sense of meaning from their job, from religion, from science like me, you know, from art and culture. But there's been this, you know, kind of big shift, this sort of seismic shift in urban living, where we also take pleasure in where our food comes from. And, you know, knowing about the New York City water supply and taking, you know, great pride in how it's protected and how it's funded and how it's managed, or that, you know, we think a lot about our kinds of buildings and how are they part of the environment that they sit in, or how do we raise our kids? So we can actually find meaning in all of these things in an ecologically conscious and supportive kind of way. And just to close with a few minutes on Vision Maker, which is connected to the historical ecology, this is a platform that we built with some funding from the Rockefeller Foundation a few years ago to allow New Yorkers to make their own maps of the future. This is a website. It's the URL is visionmaker.nyc, you know, visionmaker.nyc. And when you go in, you can log on. It's completely free. It's completely free to use. You can create your new vision of the future, or you can browse existing visions that other people have created. And what you do is it's built on this idea that I've been saying about, you know, thinking about your idea of the future in the context of where we are today and in the context of the long-term history of the site. And what it allows you to do is to change, to do experiments, to imagine your vision, to paint, if you like, the ecosystems, the lifestyles, and test the different climate scenarios of the future. And then to see how the environment responds in terms of water, carbon, biodiversity, and population. And we've been doing a lot on the economic side as well. So when you go to Vision Maker and you log in, you can see a map like this, and these colors represent the modern ecosystems of the city, the roads and the streets and the buildings, as well as the parkland and the wetlands where they still exist. And then you can see overlaid that a map of the historical ecology, cell by cell, 10-meter cells all across the city. And you can zoom into any part of the city. This is down in Brooklyn on the edge of Jamaica Bay. You can see this is a marine park, which is built on an old wetland that was filled in the early 20th century. And so you can see, you know, it makes sense why Marine Park flooded so badly during Hurricane Sandy, because it's on top of an old wetland that's very low. And then you can paint the ecosystem. So it has this ecosystem painting functionality where you can paint the ecosystems, you can change the map, you can add green roofs as we've done here. You can also change the lifestyle, the people that live in your idea of the future. And these are kind of stock lifestyles. The idea is just to help you understand how lifestyle fits into your idea of the city. So we have an average New Yorker lifestyle, we have an average American lifestyle, we have an average Earthling lifestyle, which is the middle one. We have an average Lenape lifestyle, and we have what we call an eco-conscious person, or an eco-hipster, which is somebody who's trying to change their lifestyle to limit their impact on the environment. And then you can actually see how that would manifest through the ecosystem flows in the environment, and how those changing with the climate as well. And then you get these little calculator bubbles that actually allow you to measure your water performance, your carbon performance, your biodiversity, your population, and to compare, you know, that part of the landscape with 1609, with today, and with your vision of the future. So you can actually see like what would be most effective, and you can see what, you know, how you can contribute and how you can help your, you know, colleagues and city government contribute to your idea of the future. So instead of just being in this mode where we're always complaining about the maps that people are foisting on us, we are actually empowered to create our own maps of our own neighborhoods and then share them with each other. And the sharing goes through this sort of, you know, digital social media kind of way of doing things. Because I really do think that, you know, the point of maps is to help us imagine the future in a different way. We did this at the end of Mannahatta, where an artist, Heidi Nielsen, and I took some pictures in the city, and then we just tried to reimagine what a more ecological version of that same landscape would be. Not taking all the buildings away, leaving most of the buildings, but, you know, taking Madison Square Park and having it be a real red oak forest with a stream instead of a storm drain. and maybe changing our transportation up, where we give precedence to pedestrians and bicycles, and maybe, have street level public transportation again. And, are using the buildings as places that could also have trees and renewable energy and so forth. Or, you can imagine this at different scales, the scale of the Upper East Side with green roofs across the tops of all the buildings, and maybe opening up, a way for Sawmill Creek, which used to flow through the Upper East Side, to wrap around the Metropolitan Museum of Art and go out to the East River. Or even more dramatically, imagining just the changing patterns of inhabitation in this city. If you live in Manhattan, people live at 65,000 people per square mile, but people out in, Jersey or up here in the Bronx where I live, or some places out in Eastern Queens live at 1,000 people per square mile. So, what if we imagined a landscape where everybody lived at Manhattan density? And you could, if you do that, even with sea level rise, you still only use up 36% of the area. And that means you could have farmland back. You could have wildlife sanctuaries back. You could have forests back. You could have streams back. It's the same numbers of people, it's just using the landscape in a different way, in a different configuration. And I'm not saying this is the most desirable thing. I'm just saying that there are so many different ways that we could live in this landscape. And by using maps and by using ideas of both of the past, but also the past as a springboard for the future, that we give ourselves the opportunity to rethink, reimagine, and to create a future that gives to people in New York City for hundreds of years going forward. So if you're interested in any of this, there's more to be read in Mannahatta. And then I followed that up with the book Terra Nova that works on these ideas about density and transportation and land use and energy, and tries to imagine a better future for our country. And with that, I think I'll leave it here. In Queens, overlooking Flushing Meadows as the sun sets. So thank you very much for your attention.
That was very great, very good. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat if you want to take a look at those, Eric.
Okay, let me just stop sharing so I can see the chat.
And I'm going to unmute everyone in case there are questions.
Okay. So Steve, I see you. You asked me about georeferencing. So we use ArcGIS most of the time, although some of my students use QGIS nowadays. So yeah, we're big time professional GIS users, as you can tell.
Yep.
And then this question about the place name database. Yeah, so that's a custom database that we built because we couldn't find anything that anybody else had, and we needed something. It actually started out, just me making notes in Excel, and then I work with this really wonderful guy named Kim Fisher, and he's like, Eric, that's not the right way to do this. You should build a proper database. And then his insight too, which has been really important, is that it should be a web-enabled database, which means that multiple people can access it at the same time. So I can have students, in the library or at the university, and I can be doing things. We can all be collaborating together. So yeah. It's basically just a SQL database with a front end to it. And we actually have been, we have a couple other historical ecology projects for other cities, one in Shanghai and one in Jerusalem in Israel, and one in San Francisco. And there we have a slightly different kind of improved version. This is the previous version, the older version. So does the effect of winds, currents, tides, waves, storms have a predictable effect on barrier islands over time? Yes. There's a very well understood science of how these barrier islands work. And they're basically the way nature, that's the solution nature has for protecting the coast, which is, on most days, the way the tides work, they're depositing small amounts of sand on the beach, and then the wind sculpts that sand. And then there's, plants, particularly the beach grass, Amophilia, that then roots into the sand and holds the sand, and then over time builds up dunes. And so, anywhere on the ocean side facing a part of New York City, along the south shore of Long Island, or on the part of Staten Island facing Raritan Bay, there would have been beaches with dunes behind them. And then often behind those, you get salt marshes, you get these back barrier marshes. And so what that means is when a hurricane would come, you would get the storm surge, but it would slam into the dune first, and that would absorb most of the energy. And then the water, you know, if there's water that goes over the top, well, it just drains into the salt marshes, and the salt marshes don't mind being flooded because they're adapted to being flooded, you know, twice a day anyway on the high tide. So it's actually not a problem. And that's, you know, that's the solution nature gave us to solve. And that solution has worked ever since the glacial times and probably before. You know, one of the things that's not often said is when the glaciers were at their maximum 21,000 years ago, there was so much water locked up in the ice on land that the sea levels were much, much lower. And in New York City, they were about 100 meters lower, which meant they were about 100 miles offshore. And so if you had been in this region 20,000 years ago, you would have had to walk out, you know, a long way, you know, 100 miles to the shore. And what you would have found there were beaches and dunes and salt marshes. And then as the sea level rose, those systems backed up until they were where they were when, you know, Verrazano and Hudson and James's men, the Duke of York, were. And, you know, then Europeans came and they said, well, this is where the landscape is. And then eventually we built buildings on them, right? And then we're surprised when those buildings get flooded. Yeah. That's just what I mean. Like, you know, there's like just some basic ecological literacy that can just, you know, completely reframes the way you think of things like climate change and real estate development and so forth. So yeah, so Oakland Lake is really beautiful. So yeah, this question about has equivalent history been done in other cities? There's a little bit of work. Seattle has some kind of this kind of work, and in San Francisco and the Bay Area, there's a really great group in called the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and they have a resilient landscape program, and they've done some really interesting work in California along this way. So yeah, there's lots of places there, and like I say, I've been trying to get this project with Shanghai started. It's been very difficult. Part of my gig is I have an adjunct appointment at NYU, and NYU has a campus in Shanghai, and so I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, they invited me over to give some talks. And then afterwards, we started talking about what it would be to do to Shanghai. Except Shanghai, we wouldn't be looking at 400 years ago, we'd be looking at 8,000 years ago, and then working it up. Yeah, so that seems to be most of the questions. Are there other questions people just want to ask free form? Or thoughts or comments?
Wonderful presentation, by the way.
Really great.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was great.
Thanks, David.
Yes.
You know, I always sort of have this this comment too. When you look at the, you know, sort of in the high Andes, sort of salt, salt flats and stuff, and you see buried cities under the ocean, and you think about how much, you know, sort of geology it has changed over, you know, over millennia, and it's just interesting. So people, like, we're so focused right now on this narrow sliver of time, but
That's
you know,
right.
the world is always in a state of change.
Yeah, that's right. And it is hard because, you know, we have a very specific kind of lifespan. You know, we live 60, 70, 80, 100 years. And so, you know, to think in a time scale that's thousands of years long or millions of years long is difficult for us.
Have you ever thought of, do you know the Long Now Foundation?
I do know. Yeah, I've given a talk for them before. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, I think that's, you know, if you talk to my scientist friends, you know, the concerns about climate change are not because the climate hasn't changed in the past, because of course it's changed dramatically in the past. But it used to be in the past, it took millions of years for those changes to happen. And the changes that are happening now are just happening so much faster. Yeah, and, you know, and it's also true that, you know, the kinds of contributions we're making to climate change now, you know, we really need to stop them. But what that's going to be a benefit for people 100 years from now, for our grandkids and our great grandkids. There's already so much that's locked into the climate system because of what, you know, our grandparents did and our great grandparents did. That's hard. And, you know, New York City is just full of these kinds of stories, you know, where, you know, one generation does something and they're trying to make it better, and, you know, the city better in their own frame. And then it just creates a problem for the, you know, for the following generation. You know, like I tell the story in Mannahatta of the Collect Pond in Lower Manhattan, which was this, 80-foot deep freshwater pond that actually made it possible for people to live in New York City, for the first 200 years after European settlement. You can't drink the Hudson River or the East River because they're salty, they're estuary. You have to have fresh water. And the fresh water was the Collect Pond. And then, shortly after the American Revolution, a leather tannery set up shop on the Collect Pond. And they did what was the custom of the day, which is to dump all the pollution, all the blood and guts from the animals that they were killing and the chemicals that they were using to tan the hides, and just dumped it in the Collect Pond. And so within a decade, they'd poisoned the fresh water source for the city. It's just like, it's insane to think about. And of course, that led to all these other things. Like Aaron Burr said, okay, well, we need a company. And so he got a charter for this thing called the Manhattan Water Company. In the second decade of the 19th century. And he got the state legislature to write in a provision that said they could use the proceeds of the company for activities other than water provision. And so he used the company to establish a bank. They wanted to, compete with Alexander Hamilton's First National Bank. And that bank became Chase Manhattan, or Chase Bank today. It comes from the Manhattan Water Company. Meanwhile, they leveled the hills and filled in the pond and built the city across the top of it. But then the buildings started to sink because they hadn't done it right. And the land started to subside and it actually stank. And so it became a very poor neighborhood because only poor people would want to live there. And it actually became the famous Five Points neighborhood. The Five Points met right on top of the Collect Pond. In Gangs of New York, that Leonardo DiCaprio movie from a few years ago.
Right.
There's a bunch of books about that. So, and then, eventually Jacob Riis comes in the 1880s and 1890s and takes photographs of all the poor children and says, we have to fix this. And so they knocked down all the tenements and then they built big municipal buildings. And that's why the New York City Municipal Building or the New York City Courthouse or the Federal Courthouse, they all stand on top of or right next to the old Collect Pond. And so when you go down to Foley Square in Lower Manhattan, it's actually this echo of this pond. 400 years later, it's still being felt in the city. It's so extraordinary.
Amazing.
And maps are the way you tell that story. Anyway.
Well, great.
Similar stories in Chicago too about messing up the water supply. Union Stockyards was the largest slaughtering enterprise in the country for almost a century. And they polluted the river so much, it's still bubbling to this day. And one of the creeks is called Bubbly Creek because of it. But we learn our lessons most of the time the hard way.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
You gave a similar story, so very good.
Right.
Very good.
Yeah. That's right. And they reversed the direction of the Chicago River, right?
Absolutely. That's another feat that needed to be done because we were drinking our pollution.
Right.
And fortunately, we no longer do that as much, perhaps. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
I think on the positive side, human beings can adapt, and when we adapt by talking to each other and by the stories we tell each other, and so that's why, that's why I think this kind of work is really important.
Yeah. Good.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. I know it's at least here in New York, it's a nice afternoon. So, and I really appreciate all the work you do, and Steve and Andrew, again, thank you so much for inviting me.
No, it's our pleasure, and you're welcome anytime. And thank you to the rest of the people that joined today on a Saturday. Keep an eye out for upcoming meetings, and if you hear some good things for us to know about, let us know, and we'll put it up on our site or on social media.
Thank you, New York. From Chicago.
Chicago.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Enjoy your
Take care.
Enjoy your weekends.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.